Hi, welcome to Innovating Leadership, Co-Creating Our Future. I'm your host, Maureen Metcalf. I'm the founder and CEO of the Innovative Leadership Institute. And I am also a fellow with the International Leadership Association. I am delighted to bring to you, recorded live at the International Leadership Association Conference 2019 in Ottawa, Canada, Kim Campbell. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Kim Campbell was the 19th and first female Prime Minister of Canada. Let me go back and ask you to share the definition of Right Honourable.
The Right Honourable is a title that adheres to three positions in Canada: the Prime Minister, the Governor-General, who is the Queen's representative, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. If you went to Great Britain, you would find it in the top 20 members of cabinet, people who are all privy councillors. So it's a more common title there. And it just means the very honourable. It goes back to the old use of the word right to mean very. That's right nice of you. That's right kind of you. And in some ecclesiastical positions, you have right reverence. So it just means the very honourable. When you translate it into French, I am la très honorable Kim Campbell. But in Canada, as I say, it is only a title of three positions. And one day I was in the Canadian Senate giving a presentation to mark the 150th anniversary of Canada. And the Chief Justice at the time was a woman, Beverly McLaughlin, and a former Governor-General, Michaela Jean, was there. And I'm the only woman who was Prime Minister. So we were three Right Honourables representing the three different positions that hold that title. So we got a picture. It's historic.
So, Kim, I am really looking forward to our conversation. And for listeners, we're going to talk about a range of topics from the 40 years of leadership experience you have running a country and launching a leadership program. So extending your pragmatic leadership experience into the academic space, and also at a time when we are so divided in various centers of our society. I'm really interested in the stories that you've shared with me about how you've built alliances that have held in difficult times. So let's jump in. In your almost 40 years of leadership experience.
It's actually, I have to tell you that although I don't like to admit to being as old as I am, I was elected. I was the first girl to be elected student council president of my high school in the spring of 1963. So it's even more than 40 years.
Wow. So that's 55 years.
Yeah.
Not that I'm that good at math. So in your 55 years of leadership experience, what are you seeing the changes?
Well, when I was a little girl, girls were able to do things if you were not seen to be carrying all the others along with you. People have always been willing to make exceptions. So if we don't think the girls are as smart as boys, well, maybe one or two are, or people of color, or people from a different place. So when I was young, actually my mother raised my sister and me to believe that, and to understand that girls could do anything, but that it wasn't a universally accepted proposition. And we had a wonderful woman named Charlotte Wigton, who was the first woman to be mayor of Ottawa, who used to say that a woman had to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good. But fortunately, that was easy. But when I was young, there was kind of a general assumption that, generally speaking, women were not as good as men in areas of leadership, or as mathematicians or scientists or any of these things, so that a few women excelled, but not many. We now know that that's not true, that much research shows, and historical research, which is rediscovering women, brilliant women, mathematical geniuses and scientists. And, you see the film Hidden Figures about these African-American women who were fundamental to the development of the space program in NASA. So these people are being rediscovered and changing people's perceptions of what women can do. And I would say over the last 40 years, that's been, or 55 years, whatever, that's been a very important change, that we're rediscovering the women who've been left out. I think Virginia Woolf once said that anonymous is likely a woman. There was people who don't get credit. But it's astonishing how many, for example, brilliant women scientists had to work as assistants in their husbands' labs, were not able to give their own papers at meetings. So we lose this. The other thing I think that we know, aside from rediscovering the histories of real women who've been hugely important in many fields, is the research, particularly in the 90s, in social and cognitive psychology, about how we think. And that helps us to understand that the way we think isn't really how we think, and that our processing information is full of cognitive biases and implicit attitudes. And that also helps us to explain why women sometimes don't support women, because if we live in a society where women are not leaders and where they're only leaders if they're kind of exceptions, women themselves may internalize this view that women really aren't as good as men. They may exempt themselves. I certainly did. I mean, I will sort of think that I was as good as men, but, what about all the others?
My sister may not be.
Yeah. And so, but I think now that we understand the extent to which our thinking is colored and shaped by cognitive biases, I think that gives us an opportunity to try and break through it, to become aware of it.
What else has changed over the last 40 years?
Well, I think in light of what we understand, more women have simply come forward. I'll give you an example. When I was in Parliament, I remember, and it wasn't before I think I ran for the leadership of my party, but I read an article about what kind of a woman could possibly be president of the United States. And she would have to be brunette.
Why does that matter?
Well, I guess the blondes were in serious. Blonde.
And you're blonde, so that...
Yeah, and so was Hillary Clinton, and so were, and Margaret Thatcher wasn't particularly dark. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. But I actually amuse young women when I say, when I was prime minister, I never wore trousers, except maybe to go to an athletic event. Always wore suits or dresses, skirts with pantyhose, etc. And I am very grateful to Hillary Clinton, who, as First Lady, kind of normalized the pantsuit. I don't think she has great legs. That's what she did. But she normalized the pantsuit. But also because when you're wearing a pantsuit, you're never in a situation sitting on the stage where you suddenly realize there's nothing protecting you. You've got to sit with your knees clenched together for the whole panel. But that she began, and Laura Bush did the same thing. So as First Ladies, although they weren't in government, because Margaret Thatcher always dressed, in sort of the traditional skirts, etc. I don't think I ever saw a picture of her wearing trousers. And Angela Merkel now has taken it. I mean, Angela Merkel has this huge wardrobe of infinite numbers of dark pants and colored blazers. And that's her, and that is her uniform. And so when we see the change over that period of time, the ability of women to be comfortable.
I was going to say it's more than wardrobe. It's about comfort and equality, that I am not constrained in my movement.
So, I mean, it's quite remarkable because when I was prime minister, I could not have worn Angela Merkel's wardrobe. I think I was a little thinner at that time.
And we're both wearing slacks, by the way.
Well, but it is very important because one of the things that we talk about, sort of the misogyny of wardrobes, if women are expected to wear high heels and short skirts, aside from the fact that they're kind of vulnerable to physical attack, it's a very much a playing into a sexual stereotype. And clever women are many. And the fact that I was prime minister of my country doesn't mean I don't have romantic relationships. I have a wonderful husband. I have a sex wife. I have, I'm all these kinds of things. But I don't feel I need to dress professionally the way I would dress if I wanted to go out for a social occasion and be alluring. Because the dynamic is totally different what I want to achieve. And also being alluring doesn't mean you can't make intelligent conversation. These things, good-looking man, we don't expect him to sort of go, we expect him to carry his head.
The George Clooney's and such are allowed to be smart also.
Yeah. So I think that all of those things have changed quite remarkably since I started out, that there's going to be more women, not enough, and there are still significant barriers because often you get pushback. When men are the default category, I'll give you an example. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, when he was first elected, appointed a cabinet that was 50% women. He was the fifth leader, I think, in the world to do this. Zapatero in Spain had done it, and others had done it. And early in his term, he was visiting another country, and the leader of that country said to him, "Why did you appoint a cabinet that was 50% women? Why didn't you just appoint on merit?" And he said, "If I'd appointed on merit, I'd have had more women."
That's interesting.
And, you start to think about it because we assume that somehow if you're appointing women, you're making a sacrifice. You're bringing in people who maybe don't deserve to be there. And it's this notion that men are the default category, that they're the ones who are really equipped to lead, that they are always competent. And, some of them are extraordinary doofuses. And and women can be too. And of course, we will never be fully liberated until we can be a doofus without having to reflect on the rest of our senses. But I think those are very important changes, I think, in my time as an adult operating in the public field.
I love the idea that Trudeau would make the comment,
Yeah.
if it were truly on merit, there would be more women. I helped.
And incidentally, I know a lot of men who think that way about a lot of these. My husband has a company. He says so the women in his management are fabulous. I chaired a foundation in Kiev and met with people from the Canadian-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, Canadians who had gone to do business there, and it was not so simple. And I met a man who said, I only do business with companies run by women.
Oh, that's curious.
Because they're honest, they deliver, they're very effective. It's just the men are hopeless. But
So I don't want to sound like we're anti-male.
no, but I think that there are a lot of people who recognize from their real experience, as opposed to any kind of sitting back and just theorizing, that women really do produce. That women are smart. That they are often less concerned about looking good than with being good and doing a good job.
And many of us socialized in ways that don't align with what the power base has promoted.
So we look and sound different from others who have done these jobs, but that is not a diminution of the quality. In fact, if anything, it sometimes is an augmentation of what is brought to the job because of the breadth of our experience and the way we see things and our ability to understand certain dynamics. I sometimes feel that, someday if women are totally equal and we don't have any discrimination or any barriers, we might turn out to be jerks and privileged and whatever.
Some.
But
Some will.
But at this stage, it's difficult for us to avoid the reality of learning to deal with exclusion or low expectations. And it can often make us more empathetic and understanding. Although the other side of that coin is Mary Catherine Bateson, who wrote in her book, Composing a Life. She was Margaret Mead's daughter, and she became an academic dean. And she talked about when she became, I can't remember if it was a department chair or a dean, doesn't matter, how men that she worked with were angry if she wouldn't nurture them, that they expected that she was supposed to mother them. And you don't expect a male department chair to be daddy, to nurture you. And if he gives you tough love and says, shape up, you don't feel that that's somehow a terrible thing. But so even when women get positions of authority, they are often encumbered by expectations of femaleness and still serving and supporting men in a particularly nurturing role.
It's interesting. You started with the idea of bias, that we all carry it. It's
Everybody
pre-wired, that we're a species of.
I don't think it's pre-wired. I think it's absolutely cultural. We learn it. We learn it from the day we're born. You take a baby out dressed in yellow, and people go, oh, what a cute baby. And the first thing they say, is it a boy or a girl? They don't know how to talk to it until they know what its sex is. And we absorb these attitudes from childhood. And by the time a child starts school, he or she has a very nuanced understanding of what it means to be male and female in their society.
And different based on the country.
Yeah. And,
hugely different.
And where they are in any given society, the kind of family they have, their social class, whatever, the role models that they have, what people do. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your journey to political office. You talked about being class president in 1963. Where did you go from 1963 to becoming prime minister?
Well, just to roll back a bit, I am the daughter of two war veterans. My dad was in the Canadian Army and fought in the Italian campaign and was wounded and came back. My mother horrified her mother by enlisting in the Navy and becoming a Wren and training as a wireless telegrapher and tracking the emissions of German U-boats in the North Atlantic and Gulf of St. Lawrence, because, of course, submarines can't communicate underwater. They have to surface. That it did, they radio. And my mother was part of a group of young women, and they had to be young because they sat long watches. We sat scanning to intercept these messages. And if two messages could be a message could be intercepted by two people, by triangulation, you could locate the submarine. And German submarines came right up off Quebec City during World War II. So when I was a little girl, World War II I was born after the war, but I mean, it was on TV, everything. I mean, it was the big event of the 20th century. And the fact that both my parents had been in uniform in World War II made me feel that, both men and women did serve. And I was fascinated by it, and I read books about it, and I read books about the Holocaust, and I wanted to do something. I wanted to make a contribution so that this would not happen again. And if you asked me when I was a teenager what I wanted to be, I said I'd like to be the first woman Secretary General of the UN. That's a very Canadian thing to want to be. American kids don't want to be there. Canadian kids do.
I think I wanted to be an astronaut.
Well, but I wanted to do something bigger than my life. And I wanted to do something that would help to make the world better and avoid war, etc. But my parents weren't political. They voted, but they weren't political. And I lived in Vancouver, so I was far from the national center of power. So I didn't really think about politics until when I became student council president, that wasn't even so much about political. The year before, when I was in grade 10, a girl had run for school president, and she didn't win. And people say, well, a girl can't win. And I thought, oh, that's not right. So at the end of my year in grade 11, because it was going to grade 12, I ran. And there were two boys. We were girls and boys, that we were men and women, I guess, young men and women. And I ran against two male opponents, but I got more than 50% of the vote. And part of it was, I wondered if girls could do it. And I liked organizing things, and I liked, and I was sort of the person that would take responsibility for things. If nobody would do something, I said, well, I guess I could do it. I organize something here, make it end. So that was really, it wasn't my views about the world and my concern about world peace and that kind of stuff was kind of independent from my running for school president, because I don't think school president is the vehicle which will help you prevent World War III. So, and then when I went to university and I did my graduate work in Soviet politics, and I was a student at the London School of Economics, and I spent 3 months on a study tour of the USSR in 1972. And that was incredibly interesting. And it was very interesting to go there because, and I studied Soviet politics because actually I was interested in the whole question of social engineering. When I looked at what my research was about, what happened in the USSR after de-Stalinization, what happens when you discredit Khrushchev's secret speech, discrediting Stalin in 1956 and then again 1960, 61. What changes did they make, given that they were undermining one of the pillars of their so-called legitimacy? But in traveling through the USSR, it was an extraordinary experience and very much influenced, my sense of the waste that comes in those kinds of societies and my commitment to democracy with all of its imperfections. I just thought this was a very, not the model that really had much of a future. And of course, that turned out to be true. So when I went back and was teaching at the University of British Columbia, I was by that time married. And my then husband, who was a mathematics professor, was asked to run for the school board. He got involved in the school board. And I had a student who was the president of the Young Progressive Conservatives in Canada. And he gave me some speeches of the current progressive conservative leader, Robert Stanfield. And I thought they were very wise and thoughtful. And I said, I've thought of going to politics, but someday, but I don't have anything to do with a party. And he said, well, don't get involved in a party. He said, if you want to go into politics, become a star. And what he meant was become somebody that parties would go to.
Rather than you go to them.
Yeah, that they would
become the person they want.
And it was interesting because a woman had run for leadership at the Progressive Conservative Party, Flora MacDonald, and she had spent a lot of time working within the structure of the party, and people just couldn't see her in any other way. So anyway, make a long story short, I ran for municipal politics. I ran for school board, became very well known, and that sort of made me a star, made me somebody. And I served at the provincial legislature, resigned my seat there to run federally in 1988 because the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement was the issue that was defining the election, and I very strongly supported it. So that is how I found myself in Ottawa. And it was interesting because I went into cabinet right away. Now, partly that was because there were, two ministers from my province who were not returned. One didn't run again, and the other one, I don't know, was defeated. So there was, in a sense, a vacancy. But that started, what was meteoric is the wrong word, but was a very successful career as a minister. So I first served as the junior minister, the Minister of State for Indian Affairs. Then the next year, I became the first woman to be Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, which is a very powerful position. 7 of my predecessors had been Prime Minister and gone on to be Prime Minister, so it was a very important position. I'm still the only Canadian woman to have served as Minister of National Defence. Veterans Affairs was a separate portfolio, and I held both of those portfolios at the time. When I was Minister of Justice, I was responsible for the criminal law for the whole country. And in the United States, it's a state jurisdiction. In Canada, it's federal. And I dealt with very difficult issues: abortion, gun control, gay rights, among many others. I rewrote the sexual assault laws. In doing so, had to work on difficult issues with a caucus that didn't all think alike. And because I managed to succeed in doing these things in ways that didn't alienate people, that I was very inclusive, and even with people who didn't support my legislation, I never made enemies or felt people were entitled to represent their constituents. So that's how, I found myself in a position in 1993 when the Prime Minister said he was going to step down. Now, this was quite far along in our mandate, and normally someone would step down earlier than that to give a successor time, but it was right in the last year of our mandate. And so there was a great deal of support in the caucus for me, including the evangelical caucus that were very different from me on many of the views, but I'd worked very respectfully with them. And I was elected leader of the party. Unfortunately, we were right at the end of our mandate.
Now, when you say our mandate, what does that mean?
In a parliamentary system, you're elected for a maximum of 5 years. And normally you call an election sometime in the 4th year.
Okay.
We now have fixed period elections, but that's only a matter of statute. Could be changed any time. And of course, a government can fall in a parliamentary system. If we now have a minority government in Canada, if the Prime Minister can't get support and the government falls, you either have to have another election or another party can try and form a government. So in a way, there are ways that undermine this notion of fixed periods. But you normally would never go into the 5th year of an election, of a mandate. And we were halfway through the 5th year when the Prime Minister announced that he would be stepping down, and that in the following June, there would be a convention. So when I became leader of the party, I had 4 months before I had to call an election. And given that my predecessor was the most unpopular Prime Minister in the history of Canadian polling, I mean, he's been much resuscitated since, time heals all wounds, so to speak, and people have a different view. So even though in the summer of 1993, although Gallup said that I had the highest approval rating for a Prime Minister in 30 years, I didn't have time to turn our fortunes around. There had been a fragmentation of parties. A new party formed in Quebec that had taken some of our Quebec vote, the Reform Party in Western Canada, which was sort of we had started out as Western separatists, but were very much more right-wing than we were. They took some of our votes. So it was a 5-party race. There was no time for me to govern long enough to try to make a new coalition, and we lost the election.
Before we went on break, you talked about the first election and that you did not prevail.
Well, that was my only chance because my party was quite decimated in that election. There are people who talk about something called the glass cliff, that women often get a chance to lead when in no-hope situations. I think in fairness to myself, that was not why I was chosen leader. I mean, it might have been part of people's view that since my predecessor was very unpopular, that, changing the sex of the leader was a pretty significant departure. But when I went to Ottawa, it was interesting because even as a junior minister of Indian Affairs, I was invited to speak in people's ridings, or what we call constituencies, or ridings, at their annual meetings, etc. And people would say to me after, when Mulroney steps down, you're going to be our next leader. So this was several years before it actually happened. So I think there were a lot of people who did see me as a future leader, but the timing was just terrible because whoever had won the leadership and whoever led us would have won. I think, oddly enough, if Brian Mulroney had stayed on, he might have done better, because I think when you're an unpopular leader, there's a way you can defend yourself. I never criticized him, but he could have defended himself. And also, I think he could have taken on Jean Chrétien in a different way from the way that I could have, because they were both from Quebec. And anyway, but I don't think he would have won. And then, so he didn't want to run again. But I think what is interesting is that when we look at the experience of women as leaders, one of the things that happens is that if you have a failure, you don't get a second chance. And recently I participated in a program with, I think 11 of the 12 or 13 women who've been premiers of our provinces and territories. I'm still the only woman who's been prime minister of the whole country. And the program was called No Second Chances. And it talked about the fact that many of these women were quite wonderful. They're quite different, and they came from different parties, et cetera. But for many of them, the experience of leading their provincial governments was not very happy, because they found, I think if your party is doing well, then men want the role, want the position. If it's not doing well, then they are prepared to fob it off on you and then blame you if you don't pull a rabbit out of the hat. So I think in many fields, not just in politics, women do not get second chances.
Do we not get, or do we not take?
Well, you can't always just take them.
And then that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, for example, if you lose an election and your party is decimated, I mean, there really wasn't a role for me. And I couldn't stay on as leader. So sometimes there isn't an opportunity. Now, I certainly did have a next act. What I did was, I figured out, who was I and what were the issues that brought me into politics and what did I care about? And I set about constructing a life, a post-political life. And Peter Lowen, who's the head of the School of Public Policy at the University of Toronto, said to me one day, you've had the most significant post-political life of any of our former prime ministers. And I'm not sure that's true, because I think most of them try to find constructive things. But I was pleased that he thought that, because I think that is important as a message to other women. And my sister has often said this, that perhaps your greatest contribution to women in Canada is the fact that you've survived. And I see this, you and I are at a conference in Canada, and a lot of women say to me, it was so important to me when you became prime minister, and thank you for what you did. And they don't see the fact that I lost the election in 93 as the end of the story. They see it as having done something that was extremely difficult to do, which was to become the leader of a party that could form a government. I mean, that's what you have to do to be prime minister. You can become leader of a party that can't form a government, and people will be happy to have you lead it. But if it's a party that has the possibility of actually forming a government, the contention for the leadership will be very fierce. And for a woman to become leader, is hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard. And I'm the only one who's done it. But I think what is important is for people to see me still leading a productive life, very much animated by the same principles that took me into politics in the first place, which is I'm very committed to the advancement of women. Remember, I wanted to be the first woman secretary general of the UN. Still hasn't been one. But also that I wanted to do something to make the world better. So I work with the Club of Madrid. I helped to create that organization. It's the largest forum of former democratically elected presidents and prime ministers. I served briefly as a secretary general, but I didn't believe it should be run by a member. So I got it up and running, and then it's been run by others. But I'm involved in it. We do programs around the world. And this is very important to me. And I held elected office at all three levels of government in Canada, which was kind of an amazing school of democratic politics at all three levels, and they're all important. I helped to create the Council of Women World Leaders. I was the international president of the International Women's Forum for 3 years. So I've tried to find ways to speak for women, but also to continue to learn. So one of the advantages of having political retirement thrust upon me by the Canadian electorate was that I got a chance to go back to my social science roots and start reading this remarkable body of literature that was growing in the 90s in social and cognitive psychology about gender barriers, about cognitive biases, implicit attitudes, some of the dynamics that helped to explain to me things that had perplexed me. And where I think if people understand them, and women in particular understand them, it helps to gird them for the struggle and to understand that sometimes what they're facing is actually not personal. it's part of a larger dynamic. You don't look or sound like anybody who's done that job before. That was what I faced. So for me, the Ottawa Press Gallery that covered national politics all the time, my emergence as prime minister was perhaps most stressful for them. And I had a reporter say to me, so with curling his lip and saying, "I've known every prime minister since Lester Pearson." And the implication was, "And you're no Lester Pearson." No, I wasn't. I was Kim Campbell. And I didn't look or sound like any of my predecessors. I had a different physiognomy and a different way of speaking. And for people who are deeply imbued in the preceding status quo, you're a shock. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. A young woman spoke to me the other day about leading a cybersecurity unit or whatever. She's the only woman with 12 men. And I said, yeah. And you don't look or sound like anybody who's done that job before. And you have to reprogram their expectations. And it's hard because especially she was very youthful looking, although she had 12 years of experience. I mean, she wasn't a rookie. People, and that was the other thing too, when I was running for the leadership, there was a tendency to regard me as a rookie. And because I was being elected at the end of my first term in Parliament, although, so finally I got mad at about this, and I asked one of my assistants to do some research. And of the 18 men who preceded me as Prime Minister of Canada, only 8 had more cabinet experience than I had. So in the cosmic order of people who'd been Prime Minister, I was in the more experienced half. But because I was a woman and a youthful woman, I was, in my mid-40s then, and, had a young look, it was easy to, how do you discredit somebody? You're uncomfortable with her, but you would rather walk over hot coals than suggest that you are in any way sexist. So you look for other ways to validate your sense of discomfort. Well, she's a rookie, she's inexperienced. Well, no, not compared to other people who've taken this job. Pierre Trudeau had been in cabinet for a year. He'd served a year as parliamentary secretary to the prime minister and then 1 year as justice minister before he became leader and prime minister. I had served almost 5 years in cabinet, including 3 years in a justice portfolio and a year in defense and whatever. So you, as a woman, as Charlotte Whitten said, a woman has to be twice as good as a man in order to be thought half as good. So you have to have more experience and do more things. And I think that's the challenge. But I think when we understand that there are kind of cognitive biases that do that, and our only way around them is not, we need to make people aware of them and call them out. But it's also a matter of reprogramming people's expectations.
And their brains.
Yeah. But women have to be there to change the landscape from which people get their sense of how the world works.
I think that's one of the most important messages, and one that I've really tried to reinforce with women as we're emerging through our careers, is as soon as I leave the room, because I'm uncomfortable, I'm no longer present, I'm no longer in the power base.
Yeah.
So we run technology programs as an example, and there's been a lot of conversation about should we have women's and men's. No, as soon as we step out of the decision makers, we're not considered. And so creating our own special group, I think, not that there is no value to it, because I do think it serves a role, but we have to be in the room because the world is run largely still by men. So if we have special women's groups at the exclusion of being in joint groups, I think we lose the opportunity.
Yeah, we have to be part of the mainstream. We are part of the mainstream. We have to push back on the idea that men are the default category. One of the things that also happens if you are a woman or some other non-prototypical person, maybe a racial minority or whatever, and you might think, well, in the organization, I'll reach out to people like me and create some bonds of friendship and understanding. But very often you are seen by others as plotting or conspiring, like, oh, what are you girls up to? I mean, how many times have women, we stand talking together? Oh, what are you girls, dreaming up? What schemes are you doing? You can't just be standing talking about,
the political issues.
Yeah, or where to get your car fixed, or some issue that might that men could do. I remember years ago when I was teaching at the university, walking past 2 young men in the department. I think they were associate professors, who were standing in the hallway talking about their kids. They are both reasonably new fathers. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Women could never get away with that. When you see the men talking about their kids, everybody says, oh, isn't that dear? You know, they're such devoted fathers. How great is that? But for a woman, you know, so you have all these other expectations and things that people project onto you. If you're talking about your family, then you're not sufficiently focused on the job at hand or dedicated to your work, which is rubbish.
Well, so it raises the importance of allies, that groups of whichever category we happen to be in are often less powerful than a diverse, collaborative group.
Yeah, and I think that to the extent that you share certain interests, like, for example, as the women in the film, Hidden Figures, you know, that there were no bathrooms they could go to. I mean, you know, these are significant things. And in fact, when women started becoming more numerous in the House of Commons, there weren't any women's washrooms. And they had to say, look, we need women's washrooms close to the chamber. And, you know, people, oh, bully, who, ha, you know, who knew, who thought about it, you know. And so as a group, if you are discriminated against or disadvantaged in some way as a group, then I think you do need to articulate those concerns. But I think that it is important never to cede the ground. And it's funny because sometimes women don't like the idea of talking about power. Like, you know, oh, I'd like to go into politics, but, you know, it's all just about power. It's all just power games. And saying, yes, it is. Power is very real. That's what people say.
Important.
Well, people say, do you miss being in politics? I say, I miss making real decisions. There's something about being at the center of the action. And if you think that you would exercise power intelligently, fairly, and in the national interest, why shouldn't you be the one to have it? Because somebody's going to have it. It exists. And somebody's going to be making decisions that affect you. And who are they listening to? And how wise are they? And how self-interested are they? You know, and are they going to dismantle all the environmental regulations to make their rich, corporate buddies happy? Or are they going to think about the future of all the children in society and to try and create an environment in which people will be able to be healthy and grow up and be productive citizens? Those are the questions, because people are making those decisions
every day.
Yeah.
So let's shift to the Club of Madrid. Why were you a founding member of that?
Well, the Club of Madrid actually grew up out of a conference that was held in Madrid in October of 2001. And I was a fellow of something called the Gorbachev Foundation of North America, which had been created in Boston. And it was it looked at issues of economic reform. And Mikhail Gorbachev had been involved in sort of as a patron of it. And one of our members was from Spain, and he wanted to have a meeting in Spain. And I was asked what I thought of that. I said, I think that's great. But rather than talk about economic reform, why don't we talk about something in which Spain has a wonderful history, and that is democratic transition and consolidation. Because I had been to Spain at the time of Franco, and its democratic transition was very successful. So we had this remarkable conference. And first of all, when 9/11 happened, we thought, oh gosh, there is the end of our conference. But actually, if anything, people were more committed to coming. They thought it was very important. So it was an amazing meeting in Madrid that brought together experts from around the world, but it also brought together 34 current and former heads of state and government. And the dialogue between the current and former leaders was very interesting, because the former leaders could be very candid. You know, we weren't running for anything anymore. We were out of power. We could say everything that we thought. And for current leaders, being able to talk to people who'd been there, done that, and understood what they were dealing with in their countries was very valuable. So we thought maybe there would be a value in creating an organization of credible former presidents and prime ministers who could make themselves available to advise. We were thinking mostly then doing peer-to-peer advice. So at the final plenary of the big conference, I proposed the motion that we created, and we call it the Club of Madrid, because our main the funder was in Madrid, and actually the King and Queen of Spain were at this final plenary. And but also because, so it was like this would be where we could actually create it. But because Madrid represented a country that had a very successful transition from dictatorship to democracy. So that's how it was created. And we were at that time, I think at the early time, our first incarnation was about 34 members. And I was the acting president. We started because Fernando Henrique Cardoso of Brazil agreed to be our president, but he wasn't out of office until 2003. So I was the acting president as we incorporated under Spanish law, signed all the documents and stuff. And then, he became president and I was vice president. And then people were concerned about how the organization was being run, and the person who was running it didn't know what they were doing, blah, blah, blah. So I was prevailed upon. I said, I don't think a member should be Secretary General, but I'll come for 3 years and get the organization up and running, and then I'm back to just being a member. So I got up and running, and it since has had very good Secretaries General, former diplomats, and the current Secretary General came up through the ranks, but she's outstanding. And we are now over 100 members. I think we're sort of over 110 members now, I think. So we're the largest forum of its kind, and we have people from as many parts of the world as you can. I mean, there are some places where there aren't democracies, so they don't produce former democratic leaders. But, and our members are quite remarkable. A few of them now, our original members are getting older, are not so active. So they vary in their activity. But they love to be useful. So what we found is, for example, we have an incredible convening power. We just had a policy dialogue, or one of our annual meetings on the digital transformation and artificial intelligence.
And that's a topic I speak on also.
And democracy. And because our focus is democracy. And we had outstanding speakers and really, really amazing discussions, etc. And so experts like to come and work with us because they know, first of all, that the quality will be very high, and that they will have this interaction also with the former leaders who have very interesting perceptions apropos actually making policy and using these in governance, and that we are able to disseminate the results of what we do. So our convening power has been great. We do missions around the world with countries and helping them develop their democracies. A lot of stuff on the advancement of women. We did a project on women in peace and security in the Horn of Africa, where we worked with a network of women at the Horn of Africa. And Mary Robinson and I kicked it off, but many of our male members got involved with these women. And what you find is, first of all, we trained them. We gave them lots of capacity building workshops and things like that. But if you are going to meet with the foreign minister of your country to try and argue that women need to be in the post-conflict negotiations, if the former prime minister of Norway is sitting next to you, or the former president of Colombia is sitting next to you, it's a kind of a safe space. It's going to give you a hard time. And we also find that sometimes you have value just by showing up, because people feel that if you, given who you are, think what they're doing is important, then it really gives them encouragement. So sometimes we go for the specific knowledge we can share. Sometimes it's the symbolic importance of our being there and being supportive. Sometimes it's our convening power to bring together people who will come when they see this list of people who are on the letterhead inviting them to come, and they see how serious we are. So it's been a very successful organization. And we just was our 18th General Assembly in Madrid this last week. And it's been really delightful. And I think, again, that there are a lot of former leaders, and democracies produce former leaders because they turn over their governments. And when you've done that, some people just want to, go off and make money, do things, and that's fine. But for many leaders, the idea of continuing to be useful and to share what they know is incredibly rewarding.
So as we come into the last 5 minutes of the interview, and as you're talking about leaders who want to continue to contribute, you seem like you epitomize exactly that. What's next for you?
Well, I'm actually, I spent 4 years creating the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta, which was very exciting. It's a program for 3rd and 4th year students, what Americans would call juniors and seniors, and it was interdisciplinary. And this is not the time to explain all the details, but it was very rewarding to do that. And I had taught years before at the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School when it first opened, and that was my first exposure to people who did leadership as an academic pursuit, and very interesting. So I still do a lot of thinking about leadership, but I'm trying to pull back because my very long-suffering husband, I'm married to a wonderful artist named Hershey Felder, who is a concert pianist, playwright, and actor, and does wonderful plays with composers, and he's very successful. But when he's performing, he's doing 8 shows a week, and if I'm not there, he can't just sort of hop on a plane and come and see me. So he was long-suffering during those 4 years when we were not together as much as we would have liked. Now we're spending much more time together, and I'm very happy. And I sit on a corporate board of a biotech company, but what I'm actually doing is revving myself up to write a book. And the working title is Being Female. And it's a wide-ranging exploration of the reality of being female. And I'm hoping it will include observations from my own life, but also many other areas of the female experience that I think are important and informative and provocative. And I hope it will be a book that women will find helpful, energizing, surprising perhaps, but that is something that men could also read too, to understand what it means to be female.
I was going to say, what is the message you want women to take away, but also our male allies? Because they really are, our best men are our biggest allies.
Yeah, and I think that is very important. I think it's the advancement of women is not the diminution of men at all. And most women who have achieved important things will be able to identify men who believed in them. And, I always say it's not men against women. It's the women and men who get it. We need to persuade
the ones who don't.
Women and men who don't get it. And that includes women too. So men are very much our allies, and we have a lot to learn from them. When men are comfortable and effective in using power, we have to see how they do it. And they are often very good at connecting people and not being afraid to pick up the phone and, helping people and whatever. I mean, they use that in a way that seems natural to them, and women are often diffident about that. So there's a lot that we can learn from men. But I think there's also so much that we have to unlearn. That there's so many things that we think are so that are not. And the New York Times, years ago, started a new feature in its obituary column called Overlooked No More, where they said that since they started doing obituaries in 1850, most of the articles were about white men, and they realized that there were so many lives that should have been written about and celebrated that weren't. So every week they have several articles in the Overlooked No More thing where they talk about amazing women who've done amazing things, people of color, people who just were not written about, but that we have a right to know about. We are impoverished when we don't know. When I look at the film Hidden Figures and I think, we need to know about these women, that these three brilliant, not just women, but African-American women, doubly excluded, that they were head and shoulders above the men they were working with. And we as women are cheated when we don't know this, but men are cheated. If we allow men to tootle along thinking that they really are better, that they are the default category, that they are the repository of most of the smarts, of course they'll be jerks. Of course they'll be impossible. And they will be impoverished by not being part of a society where smart women, where smart non-prototypical leaders, whether it's people of color or people with disability, all people who we get overlooked, if they're not able to contribute, that the society is poorer. And we're also diminished and become kind of small people when we sort of go, people aren't like me. And,
the whining is just not.
So it's the empowerment that knowledge brings when we understand that talent and ability and character repose in both sexes, or all sexes, because since we have variations on a theme now, all sexes and all races and all backgrounds. And if we don't understand that and see that, we're really headed for disaster, because that exclusion will impoverish us, but it is also incredibly unjust. And if we have a society founded on injustice and exclusion, I don't know how we survive, because that becomes something that erodes and erodes from within the quality of our social life together. So I don't believe women are better than men. I don't believe, I think white supremacy is a hoax and is the stupidest thing, aside from being dangerous. But I think that all of us bring something very important to the human condition. And my goal in life is to empower everyone, but particularly women, to make their contribution.
The Right Honourable Kim Campbell, thank you.
My pleasure.
So young female potential political candidates can reach out to you.
Yes, and I have a memoir, Time and Chance, which is available on Kindle or hard copy on Amazon.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.